Good morning. I will call to order this hearing of the Budget Committee of the United States Senate. I want to, first of all, welcome everyone for being here, for joining us this morning. I want to thank our witnesses. I will provide a introduction and more formal acknowledgement and thanks in just a minute, but I really appreciate your being here and making this possible. And a big thanks to our host, the Villanova Law School. I really appreciate their willingness to provide an outstanding facility so that we can do this. Just so for your information, I'm a member of the Senate Budget Committee, and the committee has rules that permit individual members to have field hearings across their respective states, but it's unusual to do it. It has to be approved by the leadership of the committee, and this is the first field hearing that I've done since I've joined the Senate and joined the Budget Committee. But I've chosen this topic because I feel very strongly about it. I think the problem that we are going to discuss this morning and the remedy that we have developed is really very important, and I hope that through the discussion this morning we'll be able to shed some light on this and call some attention to the situation that we face. So thank you for helping us to accomplish that. The fact is, every single year, victims of child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and other crimes do not receive the full services that they need. The fact is, abused children sometimes wait weeks before they can receive the full medical and emotional services that they need. There are rape victims who are not able to obtain the medication that can prevent them from contracting HIV/AIDS. There are victims fleeing domestic abuse who are unable to find beds for themselves and their children. And this doesn't have to happen this way. Every year, the federal government takes hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, that under federal law are required to go to the victims of crime. And the government instead diverts those monies to other discretionary spending programs. And none of this money comes from taxpayers in the first place. So you're probably asking yourself, how can this happen? Well, it happens through the Crimes Victims Fund, and I'm going to describe this. Back in 1984, Congress created the Crime Victims Fund based on a simple principle, and the principle is that money that the federal government collects from those convicted of crimes should be used to help those who are victims of crime. The Crime Victims Fund receives no taxpayer dollars at all. It's funded entirely by criminal fines and penalties collected in federal courts. So even though money deposited in the Crime Victims Fund is supposed to be used only to assist crime victims, for over a decade, Congress has withheld billions of dollars from victims and instead used that money to offset other discretionary spending programs. For instance, from fiscal years 2010 through 2014, the Crime Victims Fund collected $12 billion, but dispersed to victims only $3.6 billion. Congress used the $8.4 billion difference as an offset for other discretionary spending. And through a budget gimmick, a gimmick in the rules by which Congress accounts for its spending, Congress represents that this money that's already been spent, is still available to the Crime Victims Fund and therefore still theoretically available for victims. Well, this gimmick is troubling from a transparency point of view. It's just dishonest budgeting, and it allows Congress to underreport the amount of money that's being spent. But even more troubling is the problem from the victim services standpoint. As I said, victims of child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and other crimes are routinely unable to access the help that they need because the funds have not been dispersed as they should. So we've made some progress in recent years. I was pleased to see, in response to pressure that many of us were putting on the appropriations process, the fiscal year 2015 budget, the Crime Victims Fund allocation was $2.3 billion versus $745 million the previous year. So we about tripled the allocation from the Crime Victims Fund. And in addition, the budget resolution that we just passed a couple of months ago, at my insistence, it dramatically curtails this gimmick for the next fiscal year. So in 2016, according to our budget resolution, the Crimes Victims Fund will disperse about $2.5 billion. Again, we're holding, actually increasing modestly from last year's level, which is itself 3 times higher than previous years. So what's the impact in Pennsylvania? In 2014, Pennsylvania Crime Victims Services Organizations received $17 million. Next year, that will be $70 million. So it's a big increase. It's a good start. It's movement in the right direction. But it's only a start because these provisions that caused the increase in fiscal year 2015 and 2016, they're temporary. They expire when the funding expires. They expire at the end of those fiscal years. So what we need is a permanent legislative fix that simply requires that we end this injustice and we start allocating the funds in the Crime Victims Fund each and every year as the law has always contemplated but not delivered. So to do this, I've introduced a bill. It's called the Fairness to Crime Victims Act of 2015. It's Senate Bill 1495, and it would provide a permanent fix. The bill would ensure that henceforth money deposited into the fund goes to crime victims, not to other discretionary spending or budget gimmicks. It would require specifically that each year the Crimes Victims Fund disperse the average of the past 3 years' collection. So it smooths out the amounts deposited into the funds each year. That would be over $2.6 billion for 2016. I have 6 co-sponsors of my legislation, Senators Ayotte, Corker, Crapo, Gardner, Hatch, and Johnson. And today I am grateful that we are joined by 4 advocates for victims of crime, advocates who can inform our committee of the needs of crime victims, the way that they serve crime victims, and including those victims listed as priority groups under the Crime Victims Funds, which are specifically the victims of sexual assault, victims of child abuse, and victims of domestic violence. So my hope is, again, that we'll shine a bright light on the true cost of this budgetary gimmickry that Congress has undertaken, and the true cost is the lost service to crime victims who need this service. If we are successful in shining that light, it's my hope that we'll build support in the Senate Budget Committee. I expect that we will have an opportunity to pass this legislation in the committee as soon as the next several weeks, and then it will be a fight to get this on the Senate floor so that we can pass it into law and implement this. So again, big thanks to our witnesses. I'm going to introduce I'll introduce each of the witnesses, and then I'll ask for your testimony, and then we'll have a time for some questions at the end. Let me start with Jack Whalen. Jack Whalen is the District Attorney of Delaware County. Jack's been dedicated to criminal justice for decades. Back in the 1980s, when he was an assistant district attorney in Delaware County and a trial team leader, he led the respected law firm of Whalen, Doyle, and Pressman, served 2 terms as chairman of the Delaware County Council, where he made public safety a top priority. Since 2011, when he became the district attorney for Delaware County, Jack has led on several issues, including founding the Delaware County Heroin Task Force to raise awareness about prescription drugs and heroin abuse. He has received many honors from victims' rights groups and victim advocacy groups. I'm very pleased that in April, the Delaware County Children's Advocacy Center had its official opening, and I know that the Children's Advocacy Center appreciates having a talented and dedicated ally in Jack Whalen. Next, we'll hear from Abby Newman. Abby is the Executive Director and CEO of Mission Kids Child Advocacy Center of Montgomery County. And Abby has been a tireless advocate for children, began her career as a registered nurse, practicing pediatrics. But after graduating from law school, she in time became the founding executive director of the Mission Kids of Montgomery County and served as the group's executive director and CEO to this day. So Ms. Newman also served as president of the Pennsylvania chapter of Child Advocacy Centers from 2012 to 2014, when she was elected as first chair of the External Affairs Committee of the state chapter, in which position she continues today. I want to thank Abby very much and the other advocates at Child Advocacy Centers throughout Pennsylvania. I've had an opportunity to tour probably 6 or 8 Child Advocacy Centers in Pennsylvania, and I've been very, very impressed at how devoted these folks are to serving kids who are victims of some of the most horrendous circumstances. They really do a wonderful job, and Abby, I want to thank you for joining us today. Next, we will hear from Diane Moyer. Diane is the legal director of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. Diane is a fighter, and she's been fighting for victims of sexual assault for decades. She served for 18 years as the legal director of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, which is the oldest anti-sexual violence coalition in the nation. The Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape oversees 50 rape crisis centers in Pennsylvania. I had the opportunity to visit one of these, the Pittsburgh Action Against Rape Center, and saw firsthand the valuable work that they do. Diane is a board member of the National Crime Victims Law Institute and the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. She's worked on many pieces of legislation to achieve justice for victims of sexual assault, including legislation on HIV testing of sex offenders, extending civil statute of limitations for child sexual abuse, denial of bail for violent predators, and many others. Diane has also received awards from numerous organizations reflecting the great work that she's done over many years, and she's been invaluable in helping to craft the Fairness for Crime Victims Act. I appreciate all of your help, Diane. And then finally, Peg Durkers. Peg Durkers is the executive director of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Peg is dedicated to providing the best, most innovative, and comprehensive service possible for victims of abuse. She's been the executive director of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Executive Violence, which serves nearly 100,000 victims in Pennsylvania each year, and serves on the Victim Services Advisory Committee for the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. Peg and her policy advisor, Abigail Hurst, have been very, very helpful in drafting the Fairness for Crime Victims Act, and I look forward to continuing to work with you, Peg, to prevent and assist victims of domestic violence. So with that, we'll begin our testimony, and first I would like to hear from District Attorney Jack Whalen.
Thank you, Senator. I want to start by saying it's an honor for me to appear before you today, and I want to take the opportunity to thank you for your leadership, not only today for the Fairness for Crime Victims Act, but your past leadership, for example, as you mentioned, in regard to our heroin epidemic here in Delaware County, for your bipartisan efforts on the National All Schedules Prescription Electronic Reporting Reauthorization Act, as well as what we'll be talking about a little bit today, the sexual abuse and how you were sponsoring the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, all which will be very important in Delaware County. Unfortunately, we're here in Delaware County, and it is unfortunate to the extent that we probably are the third highest county in the state of Pennsylvania, with our crime hitting 10,000 cases a year and 4,000 separate juvenile cases. So we believe, statistically speaking, we're third in the state. We have the largest district attorney's office after Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and then we're third in regard to personnel in our efforts to combat crime. We're very fortunate, though, that we have advocacy groups that we partner with. Those advocacy groups, some of them are here today. Joyce Dale is here with us from Women Against Rape, and Family Support Line that is running our Child Advocacy Center, Pat Krasinski, and our Domestic Abuse Project. These are victim advocacy agencies, nonprofit groups that work on a daily basis. They work each and every day to support crime victims. We in the District Attorney's Office are fortunate to be able to partner with them so that when we're prosecuting the case, we know that there is a victim advocate for each and every victim of a crime. To put it in a form of a perspective, if you drove here today and you pulled into Villanova University in your vehicle, and when you leave these hearings today, if you went out and your car was stolen, that would affect you. It's going to seriously inconvenience you. You're a victim of a theft, an auto theft, and it's going to bother you. But one thing I'm told, the people that have their car stolen, although it hasn't been a devastating crime or a devastating impact, each one person that has had their car stolen will never forget the fact that they had their car stolen. And they'll never forget the fact that when they left Villanova at the Senate subcommittee hearing, that they went out and their car was taken from them and the inconvenience that they suffered. Now, when you look at that with a simple theft crime and how you feel victimized, and now you compare that to an individual that has been sexually abused, or an individual that has been raped, an individual that has been beaten violently, these individual victims will never, ever forget. Not only will they never forget what happened, but they will never be the same when that crime occurs to them. For the rest of their life, they will never, ever be the same. So it is critical to have our victim advocacy groups. These are groups of individuals that operate 24-hour hotlines that the victim can call, even sometimes before the police are involved. It's important because not only do they encounter that victim, follow that victim through the criminal justice system, they provide services to that victim that no other entity can provide. For example, counseling, whether that counseling be support groups or psychological counseling, all of this is money that is very well spent. But one of the complaints or concerns of all of these victims' rights advocacy groups is the fact that we don't have enough resources. We can always use more resources to help the victims here in Pennsylvania. They do an incredible job, and they make ends meet with what they have, but they need more resources. Recently, as you indicated, the Child Advocacy Center here in Delaware County was opened up, and they are now still needing additional resources to help these children. Unfortunately, what we've seen when the Child Advocacy Center opened up is an onslaught of individuals that now are being interviewed. We have a couple of trained forensic interviewers. One is here with us today. However, we need more interviewers. We need more people ready and willing to help to deal with these impacts of child abuse, because the children, deserve more. They deserve to be taken care of into the criminal justice system. Many times when we thrust these young victims into a very difficult scenario, a situation where they're being placed into a courtroom and we are directly examining them, and then they're cross-examined, and it becomes difficult. The Child Advocacy Center lessens the impact of these individuals, so it's very important. We're also happy here in Delaware County that the Internet Crimes Against Children Unit is housed right in Delaware County in our Criminal Investigation Division, and that's funded by the Department of Justice. And for many, many years, under the leadership of Congressman Meehan, we have been able to support that through federal funding and continue to go across the state of Pennsylvania, partner with affiliates to make sure that children are not being victimized additionally with Internet applications. So when we look at different scenarios that occur, unfortunately, whether it's rape, or it's child abuse, or it's domestic violence, we're in the throes of all of this, and it's important that we continue to be advocates of these victims, and it's important to make sure that the resources are available for all of our victims groups. And I thank you for having this opportunity to address you.
D.A. Whalen, thank you very much for your testimony. Your written testimony I appreciate as well, as I read that last night. That will be submitted for the record, and I appreciate it. Next, Ms. Newman, thank you for joining us. Your written testimony also will be submitted to the record, but I invite you now to give us your oral testimony.
Good morning, Senator Toomey, and thank you. I don't think that my voice carries quite as far as Mr. Whalen, so I'm going to have to move closer to the mic over here. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today on how we can continue working to help heal and obtain justice for Pennsylvania children who have been victims of sexual predators. You're a great leader on the issue of preventing child abuse and helping survivors of child abuse have access to all of the services they need to heal. My Child Advocacy Center, Mission Kids, is an accredited member of the National Children's Alliance. We proudly support your Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, which seeks to help keep child predators out of our nation's schools. The bill also bans passing the trash, that terrible practice where a school can knowingly help a predator get a job someplace else so that they become another district or state's problem. We also appreciate your co-sponsorship of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, which President Obama just signed into law. This law gives law enforcement additional tools to find traffickers and increases fines and penalties and reserves the money to fund services for trafficking victims. And we very much appreciate that the first $2 million collected will go to child advocacy centers to help fight this as well. And we're very excited to work with you on the Fairness to Crime Victims Fund Act. I'd like to speak for a moment on how the Crime Victims Fund could help child advocacy centers, which in shorthand are known as CACs, across Pennsylvania and the country, by explaining the purpose of CACs and the difference that CACs make. CACs are designed to help victims of child abuse through every step of the justice system and to obtain medical and emotional care. The need for CACs is best explained by one adult survivor of child sexual abuse. This person saw an ad that we created, and the ad simply said, "Imagine living the worst day of your life over and over and over." When this person saw the ad, he came to me and he said, "I saw that, and what clicked in my mind is that it was actually two worst days, the day of the abuse followed by the day of the investigation." Child sexual abuse is a crime of secrecy. Child abusers groom their victims and take months or years to make the child feel that increasing touch is acceptable behavior. By the time the abuse takes place, the child may feel that they're to blame, and since 50% of the time the abuser is a family member, and over 90% of the time it's someone in a close relationship to the family, who's going to believe if they tell anyway? The mission of a CAC is to achieve healing and justice for victims of child abuse. At a CAC, police, prosecutors, social workers, medical and mental health professionals, and child advocates work as a team to help that child at every step, from investigation through prosecution to receipt of specialized medical help and mental health counseling. The goal is to limit additional trauma to the child and ensure that the child receives specialized needed services as quickly as possible. In communities without a CAC, if a child is brave enough to report abuse, they're often required to retell and thus relive the abuse through multiple repetitive interviews with social workers, prosecutors, police, victim services, mental health counselors. And they do it in places like an emergency room or a police station. Think about it. When you're a kid, you go to the police station because you're a criminal or you're bad. The child doesn't understand that somebody there is trying to help them, and often, because the adults are not properly trained, they use techniques which are very much more like interrogations than something designed to actually get the child's story from the child. And too often the child is not receiving the needed medical attention and mental health counseling. And the result is that the very professionals that are trying to help this child end up re-traumatizing them over and over again. There's another danger to this typical approach of multiple interviews, and I'm sure that Mr. Whalen and every other prosecutor who has prosecuted a child abuse case has found it, which is that when you have slightly differing testimonies and slightly different statements, which happens whenever different people hear it, we all hear things differently, then you have different statements that a defense attorney can pick apart later on in a courtroom. If a case reaches trial, the child often doesn't have the strength to tell their story again, this time in a courtroom not dissimilar to where we're sitting with a judge in a big black robe, 12 strangers, and the abuser staring at them, and then undergoing cross-examination by the defense attorney. The prosecution will often fall apart, and the child and family are left in a much worse situation than before the abuse was even reported. CACs make the child the focal point. All of the professionals come to the child as opposed to making the travel to the separate agencies. The child's experience starts when they're greeted by a professional, child-friendly staff at a center, which often resembles a pediatrician's office or after-school environment to make them feel comfortable. The child is then interviewed by a highly trained forensic interviewer. Forensic interviewers are responsible for obtaining a statement in a manner that's developmentally appropriate, using open-ended and non-leading questions that will not taint the interview further. Members of the multidisciplinary team, made up of police, social workers, and prosecutors, are able to observe the interview live, often on closed-circuit TV in the next room, so that they can see the nuances of a live interview. They can see the child's reaction. They can see facial expressions. And then they get a chance to sit and talk with each other. Because one of the best things about a CAC model are watching these professionals share information in that observation room. Because prosecutors and police and social workers all come to this process from different backgrounds. And all of a sudden, things and statements that are black and white to them as individuals become gray as they talk to each other. All of the result is a better investigation for all of them and a better outcome for the child. Victim advocacy services are begun as soon as the child arrives and a relationship of trust begins to build. While the child speaks to the forensic interviewer, the family members meet with the trained advocate. Many families are so overwhelmed by what they're going through that they don't even understand the need at the time for mental health services for themselves and their child, and the advocate will help them to understand that need and set them up with the very specialized services that they need. Children often react in different ways to child abuse. The reactions can be severe, such as depression or suicide, or they could be very vague. Bedwetting, becoming introverted, or promiscuity, a decline in grades, or an overachiever. Or they may not even the symptoms may not manifest themselves until sometime later in life when some life event triggers what happened to them in their experience. Bluntly put, CACs need more funds. Every child victim desperately needs help, but due to funding shortfalls, that's not always possible. The prevalence of child abuse is staggering. At Mission Kids alone, which serves only Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, we have done over 2,300 forensic interviews in 5 years. Between 10 to 20% of all children will be victims of child sexual abuse before the age of 18. In Pennsylvania, 23 counties have a CAC, but 44 do not, often due to inability to fund a CAC. Nationwide, 1,000 counties have no access to CACs. Some counties are attempting to begin a center like Mission Kids or use services of CACs in nearby counties, and some still have no CAC services at all. Many of the nation's CACs have 1 or 2 victim advocates for 900 children. It's not uncommon to hear in Pennsylvania, as you noted, that there may be a wait time of 3 to 6 weeks for mental health services or 2 to 4 weeks for non-emergency forensic interviews. Your Crime Victims Fund bill will make a huge difference to the abused children of Pennsylvania and across the country. Thank you for your help and caring about the most vulnerable victims in our society.
Ms. Newman, thank you very much for your testimony. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Moyer. Again, your written testimony will be included in the record, and I welcome your oral testimony.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for being a champion on not just VOCA, but so many other issues that other elected officials find it either too difficult to deal with or they're interested in other things, but you've been a champion for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I appreciate that, and will never forget your devotion to this issue. I'm Diane Moyer, and I want to thank Chairman Enzi, Ranking Member Sanders, and you, Senator Toomey, for the opportunity to testify here today. The Senator talked about what sounds like a lot of work, and was, but after 18 years, if I didn't have a lot of marvelous things to say about having helped victims, then I wouldn't be doing my job. I want to thank you, Senator Toomey, for your unwavering commitment to victims of sexual assault, and I do want to read this into the record. Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape is proud to support the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, the bipartisan bill introduced by you and Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. The bill works to stop sexual predators from infiltrating our children's classrooms by requiring schools that receive federal funds to conduct background checks on employees. When you say that sentence out loud, it just seems so absurd that we don't do that already when we trust our children with these teachers every single day. The bill also forbids a school from allowing a child molester to resign quietly and then find a new teaching job elsewhere, and that has happened nationwide. We thank you for co-sponsoring the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. It's another issue that people are reluctant to talk about that happens all the time. And I'd like to acknowledge Villanova's Shay Rhodes, who's here for her work on trafficking, which is groundbreaking and necessary. And the President recently signed that into law. Human trafficking is a modern form of slavery. Vulnerable people, often women and children, but also men and boys, are forced into prostitution, often raped hundreds or thousands of times. We appreciate your leadership in ensuring that traffickers are punished and that additional funds are available for victims of trafficking. We are also happy to have the opportunity these past months to work with you in drafting the Fairness for Crime Victims Act, which will ensure a steady, increased funding stream, sensible for the from the Crime Victims Fund. While some of our elected officials voice support for victims of sexual assault, you have acted. While others join the occasional bill and then forget when they face any opposition, you have been unrelenting in fighting for victims of sexual assault, continuing to fight on both the Protecting Students Act and Restoring Fairness to the Crime Victims Fund, despite unbelievable opposition and obstacles. I'd like to talk about some of the unmet needs of PCAR and its member programs, and I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of some of the directors of our premier programs, Barbara Clark and her policy person, Julie Dugery, who does policy work in addition to being one of the best advocates in the state, Mary Onama and Barbara Clark. These women have dedicated their lives to victims of sexual assault, and I wanted to give them recognition. Thank you for indulging me in that. PCAR and our network of programs have consistently been good fiscal stewards of funding. However, as the identification of new issues and institution addresses grows with our knowledge of victimization, the demands on services, education, and community awareness are stretched to the limit. We realize that outreach and messaging to different populations must occur in order to achieve our goal to eliminate sexual violence. As I have noted earlier, Senator Toomey has been a champion for victims of trafficking who have an incredible continuum of needs that far exceeds most victims, including housing, addiction, alternatives to incarceration, trauma-informed care, and accompaniment to medical and legal proceedings. We've always provided services to men, but appropriate outreach must assure that these victims that they will be treated with the dignity and care that they deserve. We have worked extensively with military victims, and our CEO, Delilah Rumberg, was a civilian co-chair of the Defense Task Force on Sexual Assault in the Military Services. And it's incredible what the military has been able to do in addressing the issue of sexual assault, and is a leader for the rest of the nation. Ms. Rumberg was also on the Task Force on Child Protection in Pennsylvania, as well as a member of the White House Advisory Council on Violence Against Women. Our leader has provided cutting-edge knowledge of sexual assault to these issues and has brought to the Commonwealth an urgency to treat the spectrum of victimization to programs in Pennsylvania and across the nation. Our programs have indicated just a few issues, the need for sane nurse programming, prevention education needed to reach boys and men. We know that it's different than the outreach that we've been doing for decades to women and girls, and it's so important that every victim have access to services. Collaboration with CACs and multidisciplinary teams, counseling services under PREA, cyber crimes, prevention education at universities, storage, analysis, and victim notification about the testing of rape kits, transportation costs in our rural programs. People don't realize just how rural Pennsylvania is. It's not just Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. We've quite a few counties in between. And the hiring and retention of qualified advocates. We know that you don't get rich doing this work, and you have to do it with a certain amount of heart and passion, but we believe that some of this Crime Victims Fund money should go to establish and maintain qualified staff and prevent turnover, because we need consistency in the treatment of these victims. And we hope we can I know you're not supposed to ask for money for salaries, but these people commit their lives to being working with traumatized people every day. And I know they do with the CACs as well. And I know even though the district attorneys may not admit it all the time, it's pretty intense for them too. Finally, we have learned from providing services to victims that victims' compensation must be allowed to cover HIV medication to prevent this deadly disease. This medication is costly and usually not something that victims have the ability to pay for up front. Also, victims are often charged later for ambulance services that they did not call for, and imagine the trauma when the bill arrives for that service weeks after the assault. I urge the coverage of these costly but critical services for victims who, through no fault of their own, face financial re-traumatization. We applaud the leadership of our senator, Pennsylvania senator, in funding for crime victims and those brave advocates who provide services in our Commonwealth and across the country. I urge Congress to join Senator Toomey and his really marvelous staff in the swift and certain passage of this legislation. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much, Ms. Moyer, for your testimony. Dr. Durkers, your written testimony as well will be included in the record, and I invite you to share your oral testimony with us.
Good morning. I also would like to thank the committee leadership and you for conducting this hearing and for inviting me to represent the interests of our 60 Pennsylvania domestic violence centers and the thousands of victims and children they serve every day. At this time, I would like to recognize the hardworking and dedicated advocates who have joined us here today. Mary Kay Bernosky from Berks County Women in Crisis, Maria Macaluso, Women's Center of Montgomery County, Linda Thomas and Lauren Buxner from A Women's Place in Bucks County, Sally Casey, Schuylkill Women in Crisis, Beth Sturman, Laurel House, Montgomery County, Elise Sosha, Director of Public Policy at Women Against Abuse in Philadelphia, and Kristen Woolley at Turning Point of the Lehigh Valley. PCADV is an alliance of independent, private, nonprofit organizations that provide services and advocacy on behalf of victims of domestic violence and their minor children. The coalition was established in 1976 and is actually the oldest statewide domestic violence coalition in the nation. And since then, we've helped each state in the union establish their own state coalition, and now the 6 U.S. territories have state domestic violence coalitions as well. We have grown over our 40 years of service to a membership of 60 centers that provide services to every single one of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania. Our member organizations are required to provide a range of holistic services, including emergency hotlines, shelters, counseling programs, safe home networks, legal and medical advocacy, and transitional housing, not only for the direct victim of abuse, but also their children. During the last fiscal year, as you said, our centers helped more than 85,000 Pennsylvanians, including over 7,000 children. Unfortunately, 141 people lost their lives due to domestic violence homicide in 2014, 60% by the use of a gun. And we must do more to keep guns out of the hands of abusers. The Victims of Crime Act funds provide vital resources for both the victim and for the people trying to assist them, as you said, with no additional burden to taxpayers. In Pennsylvania, they're used for a wide range of critical services for victims of domestic violence, including crisis counseling, emergency legal advocacy, shelter and transitional housing, emergency financial assistance, and emergency hotline response. PCADV strongly urges the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, who disperses these funds to our various counties, to continue funding for these basic services that I just described, while also considering emergency issues and unmet needs. I want to amplify the emerging issues that Diane Moyer has mentioned, the first being the issue of human trafficking. Both nationally and at the state level, the General Assembly assigned Act 105 into law during this last legislative session. And there is a great need in Pennsylvania for us to create a model of service and to train law enforcement as well as victim service providers to be able to help these minor victims and adult victims of human trafficking. And they have very unique needs that will require many more resources. Again, as Diane mentioned, we are more and more aware that serving male victims of crime, especially in cases of domestic violence and sexual assault, call for additional resources, both for staffing as well as to outreach men and help them overcome the social stigma and the barriers that they face. Regarding unmet needs, the coalition and its 60 centers have been forced to live with less as a result of nearly a decade of flatline funding by the state, as well as the loss of some federal funds as well. As a result, we often cannot meet the growing requests for services from our communities. Last year alone, our 60 domestic violence centers reported 6,152 unmet requests for shelter due to the increased demand from increased public awareness about the issue of domestic violence and the inadequate resources to serve these victims. Every year, our national network participates in a one-day census, the results of which have just been published for 2014, and they are staggering. In one day in Pennsylvania, our network of 60 centers helped 2,498 victims of domestic violence, including 713 children. Of these services provided in that one day, 80% of the victims received emergency shelter, 80% received legal advocacy. However, in that same day in Pennsylvania, there were 252 unmet requests for services which could not be provided because programs, although they have the expertise, did not have the resources to meet the need. And although our advocates do not always know what happens to victims who are turned away, and we do everything we can not to turn them away, our centers report that 60% of domestic violence victims for whom there are no services that day return to their abuser. 32% become homeless, and 8% are forced to live in their cars in order to escape the abuse. These numbers provide the realistic answer to the too common and unfortunate question of why doesn't she just leave? Releasing additional VOCA funds can do so much to ensure that there will be adequately funded services available to help each time the victim has the courage to seek help. When there is an unmet need in the community, PCADV recommends that VOCA funds be used first to expand existing capacity and before new organizations are developed. It's an efficient strategy that will reduce overhead in communities while investing in agencies with a proven track record of success, many of whom are here with us today. We also hope that VOCA funds will support services that are broad and holistic, that ensure confidentiality and a sole allegiance to the victim. We would also hope that VOCA funds can continue to be used to provide services regardless of whether a victim chooses to involve the criminal justice system. For domestic violence victims, this is especially important, as most of the justice they receive actually comes through the civil system and not through the criminal system, always through the criminal system. These preferences empower and protect victims while honoring them as experts as to the safest way to support them in a journey to become the survivor. We do recognize also the national need for a designated tribal funding stream. And although Pennsylvania is not home to tribal nations, many indigenous people live in our Commonwealth. PCADB supports the funding for tribes in light of our work to overcome oppression for all people. As I bring my testimony to a close, I would like to talk about one more service, one of the most requested services of domestic violence victims, and one that we hope can be expanded with the expanded resources of the Victims of Crime Act. Whatever data point we look at, legal services is one of the most requested supports by survivors of domestic violence. The tactics of abuse create safety, economic, and child safety issues that can only be corrected with knowledgeable legal assistance and the help of the courts. And again, as I said, often it's the civil court system. Yet we only have the resources in Pennsylvania to operate legal services in 15 counties, leaving victims and their children in 52 counties without help. Our 15 civil legal representation sites helped more than 4,000 victims last year at a low cost of $317 per case. Impact and value like this is rarely seen in the human services system. One of our domestic violence centers that are here today, Women Against Abuse, was able to provide legal assistance to a survivor named Kendra in a custody case against her child's father. Before Kendra came to Women Against Abuse, she already had a protection-only order against her abuser, Mike, for a long history of abuse. Mike started arguing during a visit with the child, and Mike put Kendra in a chokehold and wrestled her to the ground with one arm while holding their 3-month-old child. Kendra was eventually able to get up and run into the bedroom to call 911. The police arrived on the scene of the assault and arrested Mike. Kendra was shortly thereafter connected with Women Against Abuse, where an attorney in the Civil Legal Project was able to assist in modifying her protection order to include no contact, and importantly, to file an expedited custody order to also help the child escape abuse. And Kendra was granted immediate primary custody of her baby. Women Against Abuse continues to help Kendra because custody cases are very long. There's not a legal need that can be performed typically with pro bono services. And Kendra's remained safe. Kendra and her child have remained safe from her abuser. So we too urge Congress to pass your Fairness for Victims Act, Senate Bill 1495, and to disperse the Crime Victims Fund with the average of the past 3 years deposit. With that ample balance that you described in the Crime Victims Fund, now is the time to create a stable and sustainable funding formula and to release that additional money for the purpose Congress intended and for which it has been collected. Again, I want to thank you for the championing of many issues, including this one, and your support of victims.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dirkers. I'd like, for my first question, to ask Ms. Newman and D.A. Whalen both to give their perspective. It seems to me, and having toured a number of the CACs, there are multiple objectives that you're trying to accomplish when a child is brought in for an interview. You want to determine what kind of treatment this child might need, what kind of harm has been sustained. There's the interest in trying to protect the child from future abuse of whatever kind. And, of course, there's the interest in prosecuting the perpetrator. These are very, very different objectives and different goals, and as I understand it, you would try to achieve progress on all of these in one place through one or a brief number of interviews. So my question to Mr. Whalen, who comes at this from a prosecutorial background, and Ms. Newman, who comes from a nursing background, very, very different backgrounds with a very different sort of focus, how does it work? How well does it work when you try to achieve these very different objectives in the same place at the same time?
Well, certainly from the prosecutor's standpoint, we want to take dangerous criminals off the street. We want to take child abusers off of the street and prevent them from reoffending, to prevent the crime from occurring again. But we also have to realize the compassion associated with these type of crimes. And the compassion is dealing with the victims of these type of crimes, whether they're children or adults. That's why we have been advocates of these centers. These child advocacy centers are important because they protect the child. As Ms. Newman alluded to during her comments, she had indicated, and this is what we're experiencing, if a child is a victim, that child then reports it typically to the parents or trusted adults who call the police. The police come in, and then the child tells their story, exactly what occurred, to the police. Then they may go to the hospital, tell their story again. And then we have detectives interviewing the child again, and it goes on and on with the child being interviewed multiple times. The problem is, as was pointed out by Ms. Newman, every time the child deviates, even slightly deviates from what they explained to the previous provider, then the defense attorney in the criminal case will try to make this child sound like they're lying through cross-examination.
And just to be clear, the deviation might be just remembering things one time that were forgotten a different time, that sort of deviation.
Correct, or remembering more than they did before. Right. Now all of a sudden they remembered more, and all of a sudden they're being faulted for remembering more. Or maybe the first interviewer didn't conduct a thorough interview, and now the defense attorney is going to twist, and they're doing their job under the Constitution, but they're going to twist the words of the child, and they're going to try to convince the jury who sits up in these courtrooms that the child is not being sincere. And in those particular cases, our burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And in those type of cases, many times the jurors have doubt, and those individuals are acquitted. Then they go back to reoffending typically, and we're back to square one. Where child advocacy centers bring a multidisciplined approach and bring all together the disciplines of that children. They bring in the psychologist, the CYS worker, the police officer, the detective, the assistant district attorney. The child is interviewed. The interviewed is taped, and then the taped interviewed is turned over to the defense attorney. And what we found, statistically speaking, in those jurisdictions that have child advocacy centers, our prosecutions are much more successful.
So I think that's a really, really important point. So you're arguing that the existence of the Child Advocacy Center, the process that they follow, that actually leads to a higher likelihood of getting a successful prosecution of the perpetrator?
Which is important, but equally important is that it protects the child
Right.
from being further victimized in the criminal justice system.
Right. Well, and putting perpetrators behind bars makes it impossible for them to victimize the next child. So that's really important. Ms. Newman, now, your background is as a pediatric nurse.
Yes.
In your experience, how has this process worked for individual children that you've seen in your facility?
Let me back up a minute and say that because the CAC is neutral and fact-finding, when a case comes in, when a child comes in for an interview, when the interviewer does the forensic interview, conducts it, there is no preset determination that something had to have happened. The questions are specifically asked in age-appropriate, open-ended fashion so that the child tells the story, if there is indeed a story to tell, in their own words. And nobody has a better day than when the team sits in the room and watches that interview, and the child says in a very credible fashion, without anybody leading them on, that there was a mistake, that somebody didn't see what they thought that they saw, and there is no further investigation. But then you have all those other cases that come in, and you have a child that has been victimized. No matter how slight, it could just be something, and I don't want to get too graphic, but something just over the clothes to something much more brutal and horrible. And in all of those cases, that's when the CAC works really well. As DA Whalen said, you have one statement. It is recorded. There is no question that it is not leading. What we often see, and I think Mr. Whalen may be able to confirm this, is that what happens is that there are plea bargains that before may never have occurred because you have a defense attorney and a defendant. You can't prove anything. It's just a child that gave that statement. And the experience in Montgomery County has been that the district attorney will hand that defense attorney the DVD and say, why don't you go watch that? And lo and behold, not long afterwards, they come forward and have a plea bargain struck. And that's a great day, too, because then that perpetrator is off the street, and that child never has to enter a courtroom, never has to go through that experience again. Also, because of the CAC setup, what you have are victim and family advocates and referrals to specialized medical and mental health treatment. And that's really important because the dynamics of child abuse are very different from adult rape and domestic violence. As I said in my statement, child abusers put themselves in positions of being close to children. And most of the time, it's not a sudden act of violence. It takes place over time. The abusers take the time to groom their victims. They start with touch. I remember from the Jerry Sandusky testimony, and I know people, especially in Pennsylvania, are tired of going back to that, but one of the witnesses said, you know, you knew when you got into a car with Coach Sandusky that his hand was going to be on your thigh. That's how abusers work, slowly. And in the 50% of the time that it involves a family member, the dynamics of the family become so skewed. The family often would rather not see what's going on, because if it's a mother's father or brother or husband or significant other, as it may be, who wants to see that that person who's so close to you is really a monster who's doing this to their child? And there's often the mistaken thought that we can handle this at home. We can do this as a family and just keep the perpetrator away from the child. Bless you. But number one, that often doesn't happen because they can't do that. And number two, it just leaves this person out there, as in the recent news reports about the Duger family, where the older son, and I'm just reading from the papers here, was brought back into the home and abused additional children, if those allegations are true. But that would certainly fit the pattern of what we see. Specialized mental health treatment is important for this. It's evidence-based. It's not just going to any old counselor, so that's important. Specialized medical treatment with pediatric sexual assault nurse examiners are very important for these children. Sometimes for older children, and I'll wrap up here, I know I'm going on, it's important for them to have this medical examination just so they can be told, you're okay. Nobody can see what happened to you unless you choose to share it with somebody. That's often as important as anything else that we can possibly do at a child advocacy center. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, let me go right to one of the arguments that I have heard from people who are not supporting my legislation, which is, as you know, designed to increase the amount of funds that are distributed to the various crime victims groups. And maybe Ms. Moyer could lead off, but I'd like to ask each of you to address this. And this argument is, well, it'd be a big bump up in funds, and you really probably can't spend it very well. So maybe you could address that and share with us, for the record, exactly how you would put these resources to work if you had the knowledge that you had a sustained funding level at this higher level that would be commensurate to the amount of money that's actually going into the fund each year.
Well, first of all, Senator, thank you for the question, because I believe we've debunked that myth. I think there's a special internet place where they have things like that, oh, those people couldn't possibly spend that money. Of course we can. We have executive directors taking pagers home and responding to 2 o'clock in the morning calls instead of doing community awareness and managing an organization. And let me I'll leave you with one situation that particularly moved me, although as you can tell, this is my passion. Women Organized Against Rape in Philadelphia, they were under construction, and because of a lack of funds, they were unable to do individual child counseling. They had to do group counseling. And it was in the reception area. The place was under construction, and all these kids were sitting and standing and laughing and playing, as kids want to do. And the construction workers came in and said, "Gee, I didn't realize you were running a daycare center." And the ED explained to them that this, in fact, was a group of children who had been sexually abused. One of the children was a 4-year-old who would live with a colostomy bag for the rest of her life. And I apologize for being graphic, but sometimes I think we need to be, because these children are living their lives with this constant reminder, physical or emotional, and there's no way to undo that. I appreciate, our collegiality with CACs and our dedication of our district attorneys and our sister coalition in child abuse cases. But if you have a group of children acting as if that were an ordinary day at a daycare center. And if you could see the rooms where play therapy happens, it looks like a daycare center, but it's a place where children who have been raped by monsters go to heal. I think there would be no doubt in your mind that we could find good use for this funding. We need more prevention educators. We need to outreach to men and boys in an intentional way. Prevention is no longer a dirty word. I think we realize that it does work. And as a law enforcement officer once said to me, Diane, these are one-man crime waves, and we need all these resources to get these monsters off the street. And with your help, Senator, I think we can do that very easily.
Thank you. Dr. Durkers, would you care to address the question?
Yes, as I mentioned in my testimony, housing is a particular concern for domestic violence victims, and we need various forms of housing. Often economic abuse is a common tactic used, and it may take a survivor some time to recover economically and be able to support themselves and their children. Legal services, because when children are in the home, a domestic violence home, often the children are being abused, and we know from research now, longitudinal research, that children who even witness abuse will sustain lifelong impacts if there isn't support, help, and healing for them. We were really gearing up in terms of our children's services because, as I mentioned, we do see thousands and thousands of children through our domestic violence centers every year. We were just gearing up specialized services when the recession hit. So that is an area that we would definitely dedicate money to as well as legal services.
And Ms. Newman, my understanding is that large majority of Pennsylvania counties do not have their own child advocacy centers, so victims have a long way to go to get to the nearest one. In many cases, I assume additional funding would help lead to the development of additional facilities. Is that true?
Absolutely. In Pennsylvania, there are only 23 counties that actually have child advocacy centers. The Pennsylvania Task Force on Child Protection in 2012 said that the #1 priority for the safety of Pennsylvania's children from sexual predators should be to have a child advocacy center, and they said within 2 hours of every child. District Attorney David Heckler, who chaired that task force, said that had there been a CAC in Center County, again at the time of Jerry Sandusky, that he would have been stopped after victim #1. So how many children would that have saved who came forward? We don't even know how many never came forward. It costs money for these centers. 2 hours is a long way. That's a long time, especially if you have parents that are taking off from work, that have to go, that may have to use public transportation to get there. They may have other children that they need to bring with them to the center. At the state chapter of CACs, we would like to see that brought down a lot closer to an hour, and even that's a long way. Because again, you have children, they get tired, they're already traumatized, the family is already traumatized. We don't necessarily have to have a CAC in every county, as was alluded to. There are a lot of rural areas in Pennsylvania, but certainly regional centers need to be developed and built to help all of the children have access. Thank you.
And just so that everybody understands, this is you folks aren't dealing with abstractions. You're dealing with real human beings, people who've been victimized. And Dr. Durkers gave a great example of a woman in Kendra and her circumstances. Ms. Moyer or Ms. Newman, is there maybe a brief story of a particular victim that you'd like to share with us so that we can sort of see exactly the kind of person and the circumstances in which the work that you do is so helpful?
Do you mind if I go first? Thank you. I'm particularly passionate about one story. He's actually the inspiration and the reason that Montgomery County has a CAC. His name is Sasha. He grew up on the main line, very close to where we are sitting right now. Child abuse knows no economic boundaries, zip code, or religion. And when he was a young child, he was in an intact family, mother, father, younger sister, uncles came down to visit, father's brothers, one of whom was a very well-known cantor up on the Upper East Side of New York in a large synagogue there. For people that may not be familiar, a cantor is akin to a rabbi in the Jewish faith. Sasha went from being a very normal child to, as his mother describes, one that she had to try to keep alive because he suddenly walked around with underwear over his head and a knife to his throat, tried to jump out of moving cars while she was driving. She brought him to numerous therapists who had no idea what was going on. And as Sasha tells the story now as an adult, he said he was finally able to disclose to one of the many psychiatrists that they were bringing him to when he saw his uncle go in and attempt to abuse his younger sister. And that was what finally allowed him to disclose the terrible rape that had been happening to him over and over and over again. Sasha's mother, when she told her husband about it, his response was, "I probably should have realized what was going on because they did the same thing to me when I was a child." Again, the dynamics of intrafamilial sexual abuse. It can be generational as well. They were brave enough to report it. Mother went to Teresa Vetri Furman, our current district attorney in Montgomery County. She was an assistant district attorney at that time. 10 years from when Sasha was 7 until he was 17 years old before that case finally ended with a low plea deal for the cantor. I remember before I was ever involved with this movement watching on the 11 p.m. news, bussing in supporters of the cantor from the Upper East Side of New York to say to the district attorney of Montgomery County, "How dare you prosecute our clergy, our member, our leader?" Sasha went to college. He moved out to Montana to get away from this area. And I've had a lot of memorable days at Mission Kids. I think that one of the ones that sticks out most in my mind is the day that Risa sent him to Mission Kids to see, because of what he had been through, what developed. And he came into the center, and I saw this buff, just graduated college student melt back into a little boy. And he looked at the stuffed animals around the room, and he said, "Oh my God, I would have loved this place. You feel like you're enveloped by the stuffed animals in here." And we had a bowl of just snacks on the table, pre-wrapped snacks for the kids when they came in. And he said, "Oh, those are great. I'm so glad you don't have vending machines." And I was really surprised, and I said, "A vending machine? It never, why? It never occurred to me one way or the other, but why?" And he said, "Because I can't tell you how many dozens of times I was at police stations and the district attorney's office, and I was there for hours, and I was hungry, and the only thing to eat was in the vending machine." That's my story.
Thank you. Ms. Moyer?
Yes, I'd like to talk about, we haven't talked about campus sexual assault, and I'm happy to say that we're addressing that more fully as well. But we had a victim, and the campus judicial hearing did not go well, but she knew that she had a place to go. And what I always tell our advocates is that we don't make promises we can't keep. We have confidential services, but we have a duty to report, but we always believe our victims. And the only respite this individual had from what was clearly a botched hearing at the campus level, and it was very problematic. The district attorney and I, on the side of right, of course, were trying to help this victim, but there was a lot of pushback from the campus. But what the victim did have was belief in her story and the offer of safety and services, trauma-informed, and the courage to go on with her life and move to another campus and successfully graduated because she did not get the justice that she deserved. And that does happen to victims quite a bit. But what we do give them is belief, help, hope, and healing. And that's what every victim deserves.
Thank you very much. We're getting to the end of our allotted time here, and I just wanted to make sure if any of our witnesses had a final point they wanted to make that they felt we didn't have a chance to develop earlier, this would be a good time. Does anybody have any last
just
points?
Thank you for hosting this event today, Senator.
Well, thank you. So let me really, I want to thank each of our witnesses very much. This is very, very helpful and powerful testimony, and it will help us to make the case for why we need to do the right thing, stop the dishonest budgetary gimmicks, and start allocating the resources that ought to be going to crime victims advocacy groups. I want to thank people who are in the audience. I know many of the people here are working in the front lines, helping to support and help the victims of all kinds of crimes. So I appreciate the work that you do day in and day out. I know how hard that work is, and I'm grateful to you for being here. I do once again want to thank Villanova Law School for making this wonderful facility available to us and being kind enough to invite us in to have this hearing. And I just want to assure everybody this is a high priority of mine. And as a member of the Budget Committee, I'll be able to ensure that we take this up in the committee. I am confident that we can pass the legislation in committee, and that will give us a chance to bring it to the Senate floor. My hope is that this year we will find a vehicle that will allow us to enact this legislation and provide the certainty of funding going forward at this much higher level that is, after all, only commensurate to the amount of money that criminals are putting into this fund every year. So I really thank you for all your help. I'm going to need to continue to ask you to help and keep the pressure on my colleagues so that we can get this done, but I'm confident we'll get this across the goal line. So thank you very much, and with that, the hearing is adjourned.